I am Major Evelyn Carter, a 32-year-old U.S. Army aviation rescue pilot. Tonight, I stand on stage at a Veterans Charity Gala in the Portland Convention Center facing over 700 people. Below me, among the VIP guests, I spot two faces that make my hands tremble slightly: my parents. They don't recognize me. To them, I am just another anonymous officer in uniform. 16 years ago, they screamed a sentence at me that I will never forget: "You are a pathological liar." And then they left me stranded in a raging blizzard on an Oregon mountain road. What they don't know is that the soldier they are preparing to applaud and honor is the very same daughter they abandoned to die. If you like stories about buried truths and delayed justice, please hit like and subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Growing up in Bend, Oregon was like living in the shadow of a sun that refused to share its warmth. My childhood was defined by a single unspoken rule: everything revolved around my older sister, Brittany. In the eyes of our parents, Richard and Deborah, she was the golden child, the living embodiment of perfection. She was the captain of the cheerleading squad, a straight-A student, and the pride of the Carter family. Her trophies lined the mantelpiece, and her photos dominated every wall of our home. Whenever my parents spoke to friends or neighbors, the conversation inevitably drifted toward Brittany's latest achievement. To them, she was a star. To me, she was an eclipse. I was merely the silent second child. While Brittany was the vibrant melody, I was the background static that no one bothered to tune into. I quickly learned that my role was to be invisible, a secondary character in the grand production of Brittany's life. If I did something well, it was ignored. If I struggled, it was an inconvenience. My existence was measured not by who I was, but by how well I stayed out of the way. The injustice was most apparent whenever Brittany stumbled. Despite her polished exterior, she had a volatile streak and a habit of causing trouble. Yet the consequences never seemed to stick. Whenever she threw a tantrum or manipulated a situation to her advantage, my parents would exchange a knowing look and sigh. Brittany is just sensitive. She feels things more deeply than other people. That phrase became her ultimate shield. Sensitivity was the excuse for her cruelty, her lies, and her constant need for attention. They treated her like a fragile glass ornament that would shatter if anyone dared to hold her accountable. On the rare occasions when I managed to carve out a small victory for myself, the reaction was even more chilling. I remember coming home with a high score on a difficult state exam or winning a small academic scholarship. I expected a "well done" or perhaps a celebratory dinner. Instead, my mother would lower her voice and say, "That's nice, Evelyn, but don't make your sister feel pressured. You know how hard she's working on her college applications right now. Let's not make this about you." My success was treated as a personal affront to Brittany's ego. I was taught that my growth was a threat to her comfort. To keep the peace, I learned to shrink. I learned to swallow my pride and hide my ambitions. I became an expert at reading the room, making sure I did everything right, just to avoid becoming a target. I stayed quiet, I studied hard in the shadows, and I followed every rule, hoping that one day my parents would finally look at me and see a person worth loving. But no matter how small I made myself, it was never enough for Brittany. Even then, she looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. Behind the cheerleader's smile and the honor roll charm was a girl who viewed my very existence as a challenge to her throne. She didn't just want to be the best, she wanted to be the only one. Even though I was the scapegoat, she watched me like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to ensure I could never overshadow her. I lived in a house where love was a finite resource, and Brittany had made it her mission to ensure there was none left for me. The tension in our house reached a breaking point during the week leading up to winter break when I was 16. In a town like Bend, reputation was everything, and for the Carters, the family image was sacred. So when the news broke that a significant amount of money had vanished from Brittany's class fund money, meant for the senior gala, the air in our home became thick with a suffocating dread. Brittany, as the treasurer, was the one responsible. For the first time in her life, the golden child was facing the possibility of a public fall from grace. But Brittany didn't believe in falling. She believed in pushing others down to break her landing. I remember coming home from school that afternoon to find my parents standing in the living room, their faces etched with a cold, terrifying fury I had never seen before. Brittany was huddled on the sofa, her shoulders shaking with practiced sobs. Before I could even set my backpack down, the accusations started flying like shrapnel. Brittany hadn't just denied taking the money, she had crafted a masterpiece of deception to pin it on me. With a calculated precision that still haunts me, she had stolen my phone earlier that week while I was in the shower. She had sent herself a series of cryptic, incriminating text messages from my number messages that spoke of needing cash and taking what I deserved since no one gives me anything. When my father held up his phone to show me the screenshots she had sent him, I felt my stomach drop. The words were mine, but the intent was hers. I didn't write those. I cried out, my voice cracking. Dad, she took my phone. I swear. But Brittany wasn't finished. As I tried to defend myself, she looked up, her eyes red and streaming with tears. She slowly pulled back the sleeve of her sweater, revealing jagged red scratches along her forearm. They looked fresh. They looked painful. She did this to me. Brittany whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying vulnerability. When I confronted her about the money in her room, she snapped. She told me she was tired of me always being the favorite. She said if I told anyone, she'd make me regret it. I stared at her in absolute horror. I hadn't touched her. I hadn't even been in her room. She had clawed at her own skin just to ensure my total destruction. It was a level of malice I couldn't comprehend. I looked at my parents, desperate for a shred of doubt in their eyes, a single question that would lead to the truth. But they didn't ask a single question. There was no, "Evelyn, is this true?" or "Tell us your side." The verdict had been reached before I even walked through the door. "How could you?" My mother hissed, her eyes filled with a disgust that cut deeper than any physical blow. "After everything we've done for you, you steal from your sister, and then you put your hands on her." I didn't. I screamed, the injustice burning in my throat. "Look at her. She's lying. She's always lying to get what she wants." "Enough!" My father roared, his hand slamming against the wall. "The evidence is right here, Evelyn. The messages. The marks on your sister's arm. Do you think we're blind?" Every attempt I made to explain was twisted and used against me. If I pointed out that I had no way of spending that much money, they claimed I was hiding it to buy a way out of this family. If I pointed out Brittany's history of manipulation, they called me a jealous, bitter girl who couldn't stand her sister's light. They wanted a villain to explain the crack in their perfect world, and I was the easiest person to cast in the role. The final blow came when Brittany stood up, leaning into our mother's side for protection. She looked at me with a gaze that was supposed to be fearful, but beneath the tears, I saw the glint of victory. "I can't do this anymore." She sobbed, her voice loud enough to fill every corner of the room. "I'm scared of her, Mom. I don't feel safe in this house as long as Evelyn is here. She's a pathological liar, and I think she's dangerous." That was the moment the ground beneath me truly gave way. My parents didn't comfort me. They didn't seek the truth. They looked at their golden child and decided that her safety was worth the price of my soul. They looked at me not as their daughter, but as a parasite that needed to be removed to save the host. The atmosphere in our home that night was colder than the winter air outside. A massive blizzard, the kind that locals in Bend spoke of with genuine fear, was beginning to roar across the Cascade Range. The wind howled against the siding of our house like a wounded animal, but inside the silence was even more violent. My mother wouldn't even look at me. She stayed in the kitchen, her back turned, comforting a traumatized Brittany. Around 9 p.m., my father grabbed his coat and his truck keys. "Get in the car, Evelyn," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We're going for a drive." A small part of me, the desperate, naive part, felt a flicker of hope. I thought that maybe away from Brittany's theatrical sobs and my mother's judgmental stares, he finally wanted to hear my side. I thought perhaps the weight of the situation had settled on him, and he was looking for a way to let me confess to a mistake so we could move past it. I climbed into the passenger seat of his heavy-duty 4x4, my hands tucked into the sleeves of my thin hoodie. I hadn't even grabbed a proper winter coat. I didn't think I'd be out long. We drove in total silence. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy, wet flakes that turned the world into a blinding wall of white. As the elevation climbed, the road conditions deteriorated rapidly. We were heading up toward Highway 242, the old Mackenzie Highway, a narrow, winding route that is usually closed during the deep winter months because it becomes a death trap. The higher we went, the more the wind rocked the truck. I looked at my father's profile, illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard. He looked stern, his jaw set like granite. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I really didn't do it. Please, you have to believe me. Why would I hurt Brittany? Why would I steal?" He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just kept driving until the pavement vanished under a foot of fresh powder. Suddenly, he pulled the truck over onto a narrow shoulder, the tires crunching loudly against the frozen gravel and ice. The headlights cut through the swirling snow, revealing nothing but the black silhouettes of towering pines and the white abyss of the storm. He reached over and unlocked the doors. Then he looked at me, not with anger, but with a terrifying clinical coldness, as if he were looking at a broken piece of furniture he intended to discard. "Get out," he said. I froze. "What?" I said, "Get out of the car, Evelyn." "Dad, it's a blizzard out there. It's below zero." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it hurt. "I don't have a coat. I can't stay out here. Though. You've spent 16 years manipulating this family with your lies," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've made your sister feel unsafe in her own home. If you're going to act like a monster, you can see how long you last in the wild." "I'm not lying," I screamed, the tears finally breaking through and freezing almost instantly on my cheeks. "Please, Dad, don't do this. I'll do anything. I'll apologize for things I didn't do. Just don't leave me here." He reached across me, opened the passenger door, and the freezing wind shoved its way into the cabin, stealing my breath. "Don't come back until you've learned how to tell the truth. Maybe the cold will clear your head." Before I could protest further, he leaned over and literally shoved me out into the knee-deep snow. I stumbled, falling onto the frozen ground. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud that sounded like a coffin closing. I scrambled to my feet, throwing myself against the window, sobbing and pounding on the glass. "Dad, Dad, please, I'm sorry. Open the door." He didn't even look at me. He shifted the truck into gear. The tires spun for a second, kicking up a cloud of icy slush that blinded me, and then he drove away. I watched the red glow of his taillights grow dimmer and dimmer until they were swallowed by the white curtain of the storm. I stood there alone on a mountain road in the middle of a Cascade blizzard. The wind was so loud I couldn't even hear my own screaming. My thin sneakers were already soaked through, and the sensation in my fingers was beginning to fade into a dull, throbbing ache. My own father had left me to die because he preferred a comfortable lie to a difficult daughter. In that moment, as the hypothermia began to settle into my bones, I realized that the family I had spent my life trying to please didn't exist. They weren't my protectors. They were my predators. The first 30 minutes were fueled by pure adrenaline-laced terror. I ran after the phantom glow of the taillights until my lungs burned with the intake of ice-cold air. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and then two, the adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, soul-crushing exhaustion. The blizzard was no longer just weather, it was a physical weight pressing down on me. The snow had risen to my thighs, making every step a monumental struggle. I couldn't feel my toes anymore. Soon the numbness crawled up my calves and settled into my hands, which had turned a sickly, translucent white. My vision began to tunnel the world, narrowing down to the rhythmic, agonizing sound of my own shallow breathing. I tried to remember the way back toward Bend, but the landmarks were buried and the wind had wiped away the truck's tracks. I was 16 years old, and I was freezing to death on the shoulder of Highway 242. The cold does strange things to the mind. I stopped feeling afraid. Instead, a heavy, seductive lethargy washed over me. I felt a sudden urge to just sit down, just for a moment. I told myself I would rest, catch my breath, and then keep going. But as soon as my knees hit the snow, I knew I wouldn't be getting back up. I slumped against a frozen embankment, my eyes fluttering shut. The image of my father's cold face flashed behind my eyelids, followed by Brittany's triumphant smile. I wondered if they were warm right now. I wondered if they were drinking hot cocoa while my heart slowed to a crawl. Then, through the roar of the wind, I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping, a mechanical heartbeat that shook the very air around me. Whap, 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 whap. A searchlight, impossibly bright, cut through the white abyss, sweeping across the pine trees like the eye of God. I tried to raise my hand to scream, but my muscles refused to obey. I was a statue made of ice. The light passed over me, paused, and then swung back, pinning me against the snow. The snow began to swirl violently as a massive shadow descended from the sky. An Oregon National Guard H-60 Pave Hawk was hovering just yards away, its rotors fighting the gale. Through the haze of my fading consciousness, I saw a figure slide down a hoist cable, looking like an angel in flight suit and gear. He hit the ground running, plunging through the drifts toward me. Strong, gloved hands grabbed my shoulders. "I've got a pulse. She's alive," a voice boomed over the headset. The man began wrapping me in a thermal blanket, his movements precise and urgent. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing, securing me onto a rescue litter. I remember looking up into his goggles, seeing my own shattered reflection. This was Sergeant Marcus Delaney. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know I was a pathological liar or a troublemaker. To him, I was just a human life worth saving. The world went black as the hoist retracted, pulling us into the belly of the steel beast. When I finally opened my eyes, the biting cold was gone, replaced by the sterile scent of antiseptic and the steady hum of a hospital monitor. My hands were heavily bandaged, and my body felt like it had been crushed by a mountain, but I was breathing. Sitting in the chair beside my bed was the man from the mountain. Without his flight helmet, he looked older, his face etched with the lines of someone who had seen too much tragedy but refused to let it harden him. He was wearing his ACU uniform, a Delaney name tape over his heart. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He handed me a cup of water, his eyes steady on mine. "The doctors say you were minutes away from total organ failure, kid. You've been out for a day and a half." I looked down at my bandaged hands, the memory of the abandonment rushing back so vividly I felt like I was choking. "My dad. He left me." I whispered the words, tasting like ash. Sergeant Delaney didn't look shocked. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me I must have misunderstood. He just nodded slowly. "I've seen a lot of things in this job, Evelyn. Some people aren't fit to carry the titles they're given." He stood up to leave but paused at the door. He looked at me, really looked at me with a respect I had never received in 16 years of life. "Most people would have curled up and died in the first 20 minutes out there," he said firmly. "You hiked 2 miles in a level 5 blizzard with no gear. You didn't give up until your body literally failed you." He stepped closer, leaning in. You have the spirit of a soldier, Evelyn. Don't let the people who broke you define what that spirit is capable of. In that moment, the girl who wanted her parents' love died on that mountain. And the major standing on the stage tonight was born. After the hospital released me, I never went back to the house in Bend. I couldn't. The state of Oregon stepped in, and I entered a youth support program living in a quiet foster home that provided the one thing my biological parents never could piece. I was a ward of the state, a girl with no family, but for the first time in 16 years, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a clean slate. Sergeant Marcus Delaney didn't just pull me out of the snow, he pulled me out of the wreckage of my old life. He became the mentor I desperately needed, the only person who looked at my past and saw resilience instead of shame. During my senior year of high school, while Brittany was busy preparing for Ivy League sorority rushes and my parents were likely erasing my name from the family history, Delaney sat me down with a stack of paperwork. "You have a gift, Evelyn," he told me, pointing to an application for a Reserve Officers Training Corps (ROTC) scholarship. "You've survived the worst the elements could throw at you. Now you can choose to be the person who flies back into the storm for someone else." I applied for the scholarship with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. I didn't just want to succeed, I wanted to be undeniable. I worked 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA fueled by a cold, hard fire in my chest. My motivation had shifted. In the beginning, I wanted to prove my parents wrong, to show them that the pathological liar was actually a person of integrity. But as the months passed, that desire faded. I stopped caring about their opinion entirely. My mission was no longer about them. It was about ensuring that I would never be that weak, shivering girl in the snow ever again. I was building armor 1 credit hour and 1 physical PT test at a time. Against all odds, the girl they abandoned was accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point. The 4 years at West Point were the hardest of my life, but I thrived in the discipline. While other cadets complained about the grueling marches and the sleep deprivation, I leaned into it. To me, a rucksack march in the rain was nothing compared to a blizzard on Highway 242. I graduated near the top of my class and earned a coveted slot in Army Aviation Flight School at Fort Rucker. I didn't just want to fly, I wanted to be a medevac pilot. I wanted to be the one on the other end of the hoist. Years of training turned me into Major Evelyn Carter. I became a specialist in unflyable conditions, high-altitude rescues, combat extraction in zero visibility, and most notably, mountain SAR search and rescue operations. I earned a reputation for being the pilot who could hold a hover in a gale force wind while a medic lowered down to save a life. My colleagues called me the Ghost of the Cascades because I seemed to move through the storms with a calm that defied logic. But it wasn't logic. It was memory. Every time I pull the collective and feel the Black Hawk lift into a darkening sky, every time the windshield begins to crust with ice, and the wind tries to rip the controls from my hands, I am back on that mountain road. I remember the smell of the frozen pine needles and the terrifying silence of being left behind. I don't fear the storm anymore because I have lived through the worst one imaginable. I fly for the people who have been discarded. I fly for the ones who think no one is coming. And as I navigate through the whiteouts that once nearly claimed my life, I realize that the spirit of a soldier Delaney saw in me wasn't about being a hero. It was about the refusal to stay down. My parents thought they were leaving me to die, but they were actually giving me the only environment where I could truly learn to soar. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon. My commanding officer informed me that our unit had been selected to represent the U.S. Army at the prestigious Veterans Charity Gala at the Portland Convention Center. It wasn't just a formal dinner. It was a high-profile fundraising event dedicated to supporting the very mountain rescue teams that had saved my life 16 years ago. because of my record having successfully executed missions that resulted in the rescue of over 40 individuals from the treacherous Oregon wilderness. The committee wanted me to be the keynote speaker. They wanted me to tell my story of resilience. They wanted the audience to see the face of the pilot who flew when everyone else was grounded. A few days before the event, the organizing committee sent over the final guest list and the seating chart for the VIP donors. I was sitting in my office at the airfield, the hum of distant rotors vibrating through the floor as I scrolled through the names of Portland's elite. My breath hitched when I reached the Diamond Sponsors section. Richard Carter, CEO of Carter Infrastructure. My heart didn't race. It went cold, a familiar sensation that felt exactly like the ice on Highway 242. Beside his name was my mother's, Deborah Carter. They weren't just attending. They were major corporate sponsors buying their way into a reputation of philanthropy and community support. The irony was so sharp it felt physical. The man who had abandoned his own child to the elements was now writing tax-deductible checks to save strangers from the same fate. For 3 nights, I didn't sleep. I stood on my balcony looking out toward the dark silhouette of the mountains, debating whether to withdraw. I could easily claim a mission conflict or a sudden illness. Seeing them meant reopening a wound I had spent over a decade cauterizing. I knew how it would go. They would be there in their designer clothes, shaking hands with generals playing the part of the perfect patriotic citizens. But then I thought about the truth. For 16 years, the narrative they had constructed was that I was a failure, a liar, a girl who had disappeared into the shadows of her own shame. Brittany was likely still the golden child, and I was the dark secret they had successfully buried. I realized then that I wasn't going to Portland to seek revenge. Revenge is a petty emotion. It implies that they still have power over me. I was going there for something much more potent, the truth. I wasn't the girl in the thin hoodie anymore. I was a major in the United States Army. I was a pilot who had mastered the very storms they thought would kill me. I decided I would stand on that stage not as their daughter, but as their reckoning. I would speak the truth not to hurt them, but to finally set myself free from the lie they had forced me to live. They had left me in the dark, but tonight I was going to bring the light. Have you ever had a family member or someone close to you believe a lie about you even when you were telling the truth? Please comment yes or no. And if this story resonates with you, please hit the like button so others can hear it too. The lights of the Portland Convention Center were bright, illuminating a sea of white linens and expensive evening gowns. I stood in the wings, the heavy, familiar weight of my army dress uniform settled on my shoulders. I had spent hours preparing this speech, rehearsing every syllable until it was carved into my mind, but as the master of ceremonies began his introduction, my heart began a rhythmic, low-level thud against my ribs. We are honored to have here tonight a pilot whose bravery in the face of impossible weather conditions has saved over 40 lives. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major Evelyn Carter. As I stepped into the blinding glare of the spotlight and onto the elevated stage, the applause was deafening. More than 700 people, generals, CEOs, community leaders, rose to their feet in a standing ovation. It was the kind of validation I had spent my childhood desperate for, but now it felt oddly hollow. I didn't care about their applause. I cared about 2 people in the front row. I walked to the podium and placed my notes down, but I didn't look at them. My eyes went straight to the Carter Infrastructure Vive IP table. They were there just as I knew they would be. Richard Carter looked distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch, his gaze fixed on me with polite, detached curiosity. Deborah Carter was beside him, looking elegant, her smile practiced. Neither of them registered who I was. To them, I was just another anonymous officer with ribbons on her chest. I took a deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned environment tasting like dust. I didn't use the standard "thank you for having me" opener. I grew up in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains here in Oregon. I began my voice clear and steady over the professional sound system. It's a place of incredible beauty, but also of unforgiving ruthlessness. 16 years ago, during the worst blizzard this state had seen in a decade, a young girl just 16 years old was left on a mountain highway at night. I watched my parents. My father took another slow sip of his drink, his face unchanged. My mother seemed to shift in her seat, her brow furrowing slightly. She wasn't there by accident. I continued each word, a slow, deliberate drop of truth into the silence. She was driven there by her own father. He pulled his truck onto the icy shoulder, unlocked the door, and told her to get out. He told her she was a liar, that she was a monster, and that she didn't belong in their perfect family. He shoved her into the snow with only a thin hoodie for warmth and drove away. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. I didn't name them. I didn't have to. I felt the atmosphere shift from polite interest to shocked, unified indignation. She wasn't a monster, I said, my voice hardening. She was a scapegoat, a convenient sacrifice for a sister's lies and a parent's desperate need to believe a comfortable fiction. That girl spent 2 hours hiking through waist-deep snow, fighting against hypothermia, fighting against the suffocating weight of the realization that the people who were supposed to love her most had abandoned her to die. I saw my father's glass stop halfway to his mouth. My mother's polite smile had vanished, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. They were looking at me now, really looking at me. They were seeing the uniform, the rank, but beneath it all, they were recognizing the phantom they thought they had buried in the Cascade snow. She survived, I said, the audience leaning in hung on my every word. She survived because a different kind of guardian found her. An Oregon National Guard helicopter found her near-frozen body, and a sergeant named Marcus Delaney pulled her up. He didn't ask her if she was a liar. He asked her to hold on. He told her she had the spirit of a soldier. I took that spirit, I continued, and I built a life they couldn't control. That girl became a major in the United States Army. She learned to fly the very helicopters that saved her, and she has spent the last decade returning to that same mountain highway, flying into the same storms to save over 40 other people. I fly because I know what it feels like when no one is coming. The applause started hesitant at first, and then exploding into a thunderous roar. People were standing again, some with tears streaming down their faces. But I wasn't listening to them. I was staring down at my parents. My mother's hand was clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrifying, crushing recognition. She looked as if she were about to collapse. My father's jaw was set tight, but his face had turned the color of ash. His eyes were focused on the medals on my chest, medals earned for the very courage he said I was incapable of possessing. He was looking at the woman he had abandoned, the daughter who had risen from the grave of his own lies to stand on a stage he had paid to create. I didn't smile. I didn't glare. I just looked at them with the calm, terrifying certainty of a truth that could no longer be denied. I stand here tonight, I concluded, to prove that sometimes the person who needs to be saved most is the one the family was too weak to love. I stepped back from the podium as the audience continued to applaud, my heart finally finding its rhythm. The story of my pathological lies was dead. The story of my redemption had just begun. The gala continued in a blur of handshakes and hollow congratulations, but my mind was elsewhere. I had done what I came to do. As I made my way toward the exit, seeking the quiet of the hotel corridor, I heard the frantic clicking of heels on the marble floor behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The air seemed to chill, a ghostly echo of that night 16 years ago. Evelyn, Evelyn, is it really you? I stopped and turned slowly. My mother stood a few feet away, her expensive silk dress shimmering under the hallway lights, but her face was a mask of devastation. Her eyes were red, Her mascara smudged, and she was trembling so violently that she had to lean against the wall for support. My father stood a step behind her. For the first time in my life, he looked small. The man who had loomed like a giant of authority and judgment now seemed withered. His shoulders slumped, his mouth slightly agape, as if the words he wanted to speak had died in his throat. "Evelyn," my mother sobbed, reaching out a hand she didn't dare to let touch me. We had no idea. We thought you moved away, that you wanted nothing to do with us. We didn't know you had become this." I looked at them both, my expression as flat and calm as a horizon before a storm. I didn't feel the surge of anger I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy sense of pity. They looked like strangers to me, people I had met in a previous life whose names I could barely recall. "You knew exactly what I had become?" I said, my voice echoing in the long, empty hallway. "You became the architects of my death that night. You didn't lose me. You discarded me." My father finally found his voice, though it was thin and raspy. "Evie, listen. About that night. Things were complicated. Brittany was in a bad place, and we were stressed and—" "Stressed?" I interrupted, a sharp, cold laugh escaping my lips. "You were stressed, so you drove your 16-year-old daughter into a level 5 blizzard and pushed her out into the dark. You left me with no coat, no food, and no hope, all to protect the reputation of a girl who had spent years manipulating you." "We're so sorry," my mother wailed, the tears streaming down her face. "Please, Evelyn. We want to make it right. We want you to come home. We can be a family again. We can tell everyone the truth." I stepped closer, looking directly into my father's eyes. He flinched. "I have one question for you," I said. "Are you standing here apologizing because you truly regret what you did to a child? Or are you apologizing because 700 of the most influential people in this city just heard what kind of philanthropists you really are? Is this about my pain, or is it about the damage to your corporate image?" The silence that followed was my answer. My father looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. He knew, and I knew, that if I hadn't stood on that stage with these medals on my chest, they would have walked right past me without a second glance. "I forgave myself a long time ago," I said, my voice softening but remaining firm. "I spent years thinking I was the problem, that I was the pathological liar you called me. I had to forgive myself for believing your lies. But as for you, you don't get to play the role of the grieving parents now that I've turned out to be a success." "Evelyn, please," my mother started. "No," I said, raising a hand to silence her. "I am Major Evelyn Carter of the U.S. Army. That is the only identity I have now. The girl you left in the snow died that night. You don't have a daughter anymore. You just have a story that people are going to be whispering about for a very long time." I turned my back on them and walked away. I didn't look back to see them crying or to see them standing in the shadow of their own making. I walked toward the glass doors of the hotel, out into the cool Portland night, breathing air that finally felt clean. If you have ever had to set a hard boundary with toxic people to save your own sanity, please leave a comment below. Your strength might inspire someone else to do the same. And make sure to subscribe if you want to hear more stories of survival and standing your ground. The aftermath of that night rippled through the quiet community of Bend like a slow-moving shockwave. In a world where corporate social responsibility and family values are the currency of success, the truth is a devastating auditor. Within months, I heard through the grapevine that Carter Infrastructure had lost several major government contracts and high-profile partners. It turns out that people don't particularly want to build the city's future with a man who abandoned his own daughter in the past. Brittany, the golden child whose lies had started it all, couldn't handle the sudden shift in the social climate. The whispers followed her to the country club and the local boutiques. The sensitivity she once used as a weapon was no longer a shield against the town's collective cold shoulder. She eventually packed her bags and moved to another state, trying to find a place where her name didn't carry the weight of a mountain blizzard. My parents followed shortly after selling the family estate and fading into a quiet, shadowed anonymity. The perfect family they had spent decades constructing had collapsed, not because of a lie, but because of the truth. But I didn't stay to watch the ruins. I had a different horizon to focus on. I returned to my unit at the Oregon National Guard base, where the air smells of jet fuel and the sound of rotors is the only lullaby I need. My life isn't defined by the people who left me, but by the people I refuse to leave behind. I continue to fly rescue missions, often in the very same Cascade Range where I once faced the end. Every time I pull the collective and feel the powerful vibration of the Black Hawk as it lifts into a whiteout, I think of that 16-year-old girl standing on the shoulder of Highway 242. I remember her terror, her freezing breath, and the moment she realized she was entirely alone. But I don't look back with pain anymore. I look back with a sense of profound gratitude for the stranger who taught me that I had the spirit of a soldier. I realized then that my return to that stage in Portland wasn't about revenge. Revenge would have been staying to watch them fail or using my position to crush them. But I didn't need to do any of that. I didn't go back to destroy them. I went back to reclaim the girl they tried to erase. The soldier didn't come back to settle a score. She came back to prove that the girl they abandoned survived. She grew up. She learned to fly. And in the end, she became the miracle she once prayed for on a dark, frozen mountain road. Now when I look down from the cockpit at the swirling snow below, I don't see a graveyard. I see a sky that belongs to me. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Your support means the world. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and redemption, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to check out the next videos in the description below for more incredible stories. Stay safe and keep climbing.